Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. I am Brock, and I am an independent developer and the president of the board at the CGDC. Let's just take a minute and go around and introduce everyone.
I'm Chera. I'm an indie developer for So Peculiar. It's my own studio I run with my husband. We just released our first project, so we are just getting into the industry.
My name's Adam Dalhaus. I'm a writer, creator, and artist of the unseen. Me and my wife are independent game developers, and we just released our game last year. And so, yeah, we're just in the mix of it. So,
Hi, my name is Kevin Schut. I'm a professor of media and communication at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, Canada. And I'm also the founder of the game development program at TWU and the program lead. I'm also the author of the book of Games and God, a Christian exploration of video games.
I'm Phil Conrod. I run Bible Bite Games and Kidware Software and Bible Bite books too. So we publish curriculum for teaching game development for secular schools, Christian schools, and then we also have games we've published. I also have the notorious reputation of being one of the oldest game developers, Christian game developers. So I show up in Wikipedia articles and people reference the first Bible Bite. Anyway, so yes, I've been around a long time.
Welcome, Phil.
just because you grew up doesn't mean you grow old, right?
Yes, I had the benefit of starting out with my dad, and I've outlived him. So.
And I'm Chris Pranger. I'm a former localization writer-editor at Nintendo of America. Worked on Animal Crossing New Leaf and Hyrule Warriors, Yoshi's Woolly World, Star Fox Zero, a few big ones like there. And I'm currently going through quite a snowstorm here in Portland, Oregon. So if I'll try to keep my mic muted as much as possible, unless it's not coming through. But if I cut out suddenly, it's probably still okay. Might have lost power. We'll see.
Well, thank you for joining us, Chris. So we are here today to discuss a video called Why Aren't There Any Good Christian Games? It's a video essay on the Moon channel. And if you haven't watched the video, if you're watching this video and haven't watched that video, I just ask you to take a minute to pause this video and go watch his video essay. It's about 45 minutes. It's well worth your time. He has a very compelling thesis about why as he lays out why he doesn't believe there's any good Christian games. And that's the focus of this conversation today. So before we jump in to his content, I first wanted to talk about the label of Christian games. Do you think it's a helpful label? Do you think it's harmful? Where are you coming into this conversation?
Just from my experience lately, because when I started making my game, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I just knew I wanted to write a good story and get into it. As I got into it more and more and more, I started realizing how incredibly niche it was with, so is it for the secular or is it for the Christian? And then the second you put a Christian label on it, people are like, I'm not going to look at that because I don't want to hear the Jesus stuff. And then the Christians are like one guy came up to me one time and he's like, well, what about engraven images and worshiping that? And you have to go down that legalistic road, which that video very much gets into. And I found myself getting really stirred up. I'm like, but one guy asked me one time, he said, why are you making this game? And he's not a Christian or anything. And I stopped for a minute and I'm like, it's really just the game I wanted to make. And I think that that's where most game developers should take that approach of like, let's just take a story and make it good, Christian or not. But when you do put that Christian label on it, you do narrow your road quite a bit into who will play it, gamer or not. So that's just it's actually a struggle of mine. So
I can relate to that. I started making games later in life. I was 31 when I started teaching myself, and I think I struggled with, to be honest, just justifying the time that I was spending learning to make games, because it didn't seem like an important enough thing to be doing. And so I really wrestled with, should I attach some kind of mission and purpose to it just to validate? And I, of course, didn't articulate that until way down the road when I realized, oh, I think I'm trying to do a whole lot here for my own insecurity. And so the game that I had started, eventually we decided let's just leave it as a metaphor and call it call it good enough for that. But I can relate to what you just said, Adam, very much.
Did you ever find that you used the Christian games label to justify what you were doing?
I think so. It definitely made it sound more important and like a more worthy cause to spend my free time on. Mm-hmm.
I also came from the place of me and my wife play a lot of games, period. Video games, board games, it doesn't matter. And the whole reason I made this game was because we were playing a lot of like really dark, just extremely dark games. I don't even want to name them. There's enough of them out there. You can use your imagination. But I was like, this game is so good. Like, why isn't there anything out there that's this engaging, but edifying? And so I came from the point of like, I want to make something like this, but I want to change the power source. The power source being the Holy Spirit, God, angels, the word, and things like that. And so I didn't even really want to make it quote unquote Christian, but I just wanted it to be testimonial and not really targeted towards the church, but targeted towards anybody that likes that type of game. So I'm like, if I can make it look like these games that I'm playing, because I know, I don't know if I should use examples, but we were playing Diablo a lot. And that was the game we were playing a lot. And I'm like, oh, this is just so good, but it's so dark. Evil versus evil. And you have to be more evil than the bad guy to defeat the evil thing, right? And I'm like, this is just so twisted. And so I'm like, can we do the same thing? Because the enemy is very dark. We know it's dark. Everybody knows it's dark. We're all fighting the same war. And so I think putting a Christian label on it, I kind of was afraid to do that for the longest time because I'm like, I just want to write this story. I just want it to impact people. And if they play it, cool, if they like it. And people started playing it at my house and they're like, when can I get this? And I'm like, I'm just doing this as for fun, but okay. And then I take the next step, Christian and not. And so.
It's funny, things haven't changed over the last 30 years. When I started, I had a similar issue, and this is back in the 80s. And so the games that were coming out most games were dark. And I was a pastor's kid, and my dad wouldn't let me play those games. And so I had to come up with my own games. And so I actually developed games that were for the secular market first. And then I went into the Christian market. Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening, I have two different companies. So one is focused on I call it the Christian market. And then there's one focused on the secular market. And I market to them very differently. And what I provide content for each of those is very different. So I go after an audience, a specific audience, and then I ask what is it they're looking for, what is it they need, what will they want to buy, and then I sell to that. And so for me, I'm able to be schizophrenic in a way because I go, okay, we're going to do that through Kidware software, or we're going to do that through Bible Light games and books. And so it's allowed me to be creative on both sides. So for me, I've just divided my world that way. Now, I should say the Kidware software is still family friendly. You won't have any problem having your kids play with it, but it's a different audience.
For sure.
The timing of this conversation is interesting, Brock, because I literally just finished a chapter on defining Christian games as a genre for an academic collection. And the short version of my take on it is that there isn't really any broad agreement on what that means right now. For sure. And so to ask, is it helpful or hurtful, really kind of depends on context. What Phil was just talking about, there is sort of a nascent market, right? Like there's sort of this beginners kind of thing that it's quite small. And if any game that was called Christian went mainstream or large scale, it would probably do a lot of defining, right? Like it would probably, this is what Christian games mean. So I think we're still kind of talking about something that's a little amorphous. What was interesting about that video is that he actually, defined very clearly, this is what I mean by Christian game. The definition that he put down is a reasonable one, but I'm not sure that that's where things are going to settle.
Yeah, sure.
And when you start mixing in denominational beliefs on whether or not games are canon, because this is getting into the video, but like when you start mixing that in, it's like one denomination will be like, well, you can and can't do this, or you can and can't do that. And I really just kind of broke away from all that. I'm like, okay, I don't really care, because if you try to please everybody, you're just going to run yourself crazy. So I'm like, I'm just going to stay as true to God's spirit as I can, true to the word as I can, but tell a very surreal, very visceral story. And I think that like Christians are starting to do that now. I think that floodgate is starting to open. All of you here are very much on the spearhead of that, and plenty of others that I could name. But it's because of the availability of technology and how we can come together, and it doesn't take as much resources and money to make things as it used to be. And so I think that's really, really cool thing. So you're starting to see more people get more bold about their ideas and doing, what we're doing.
Mhm.
So
Let me jump into his opening statement. At the beginning of the video, he says, Christian media is a fascinating paradox. It must be educational yet entertaining, docile yet engaging, and spiritual but approachable. And my question was, who defined these requirements? They certainly seem like unspoken rules kind of in place, but do you think it was market forces or church leaders or early Christian media creators that just created a precedent?
I'd almost say, coming from Nintendo, I kind of have a big irony to kind of perspective on this. Is Nintendo's probably arguably the most family friendly company that currently makes AAA games, especially. Household name. I mean, everyone had a Nintendo, even if you had a Sega or something. But the big irony is that even though Nintendo is very family focused and a lot of the games are very Christian safe, when they started in the industry with the Nintendo Entertainment System, they had a very strict no religion, no theology, none of that. So the industry started from this point of religion has to be put out of sight, cannot be there. So anything in like the Japanese side wasn't so concerned about that. This was the American side specifically. So like in Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest in Japan, they had symbols on churches that were just the cross. And that was removed in the US. And that sort of just simple iconography was removed. And it was put more and more in the fringes, which is why you had so many Christian-focused games are generally bootleg. Or so silly that you kind of have to like smile and love them, like Super Noah's Ark 3D, where it's like this is a game that it took Wolfenstein 3D, a very adult, violent game. I mean, stopping Nazis is a good thing, I think we can all agree on, but still like not a kid-friendly game. But they're like, we're going to make it Noah knocking out sheep in his ark using a slingshot. But to play the game, we have to build a cartridge to get around the Super Nintendo lockout chip. So you have to be kind of you're morally ambiguous to even play this game because it's not licensed. So there's a whole weird dichotomy of I'm trying to keep this Christian, but also I'm making you do kind of unchristian things, and I'm not really playing by the rules. But as a result, again, of Nintendo having these really, really strict rules, I think that kind of dictated the direction a lot of Christian gaming started as, which is where the definitions now kind of carry forward. So a lot of this, now a Christian game has to really wave that Christian flag, or at least that's what they thought at the beginning. Even though again a lot of them were bootlegs, they're like, no, but we're Christian bootlegs, so we're finding a way around the system, and the only way we can talk about our faith is around the system. So therefore, we're going to have to make that the big point. We're not just going to be any old bootleg. We're a bootleg for Christ, and so we kind of have that kind of shifted things in a strange way that has carried over into now. And so now when we talk about a Christian game, much of the time we're expecting it to have, stamped very clearly like, oh, this is a Christian game. I'm going to be able to find all of these things that tell me, every time. It's almost like reading a book, and anytime I'm like, wait, what book am I reading? Oh, right, the name of the book is at the top of the page. Like I can see that every time. Like we see a lot of Christian games kind of do that. Like, no, we don't want you to get too far away before you realize this is still a Christian game. We're still pointing to Christ. We're still talking about, not violence, and we're emphasizing family values. And don't forget, keep looking at the top of the page. We're still there. So that's kind of what I've seen happen, and kind of why I think the definition kind of shifted that direction.
There's also the thing of like, when it comes to violence, right? So I'm like, well, what age group are you marketing to? Well, if you're making the game for education, which Phil, I know that you do a lot of that stuff, and you're like, hey, this is to help kids understand, what the Bible means. And then you have people who are like, my game, for instance, is very violent. And I did that on purpose because the spiritual world that they're in is very visceral and it's very vicious. And in a lot of games, secular games, you'll have this thing where people want to make deals, bargains, or trades with, different type of evil entities. And I'm like, I want to make these things so vicious and so unrelatable. All you want to do is take them out. And so it's like we're getting to a page to where I think that it depends on your market, but like in some cases, it's like, don't be afraid to pull your punches. Like, don't be afraid to say, hey, we live in a very real, very dark world, and we're all fighting a very similar battle, there's forces of darkness, and it comes in many different forms. And so I think that um, if you're targeting towards, I remember being a kid, my mom was the same way. She was like, you can't watch He-Man, you can't play these certain types of games. And then I was playing Zelda, and she was like, oh, look, the little guy has a cross on his shield, so it was like, cool, I'm in, I can play Zelda, right? So I ate that game up. And as I got older in my younger childhood years, she was very limited on what I could play. And then the big D&D thing came out. She's like, I don't even want you hanging out with kids who play D&D. That became the forbidden fruit, right? I'm like, well, now I really want to play D&D, So as time progresses and we're in this era where we're all independent developers, you're starting to see what I was really impressed with Phil's game, for instance, is they took a story about the story of Egypt with Moses, huh?
I think it was
I'm sorry.
an acronym.
Oh yeah. So yeah, in your game, how you're like, I'm going to tell a story about a different person that's not necessarily mentioned in the Bible, and take creative liberties and use him as a way to view into the story of Moses. I thought that was brilliant. I'm like, okay, so this has an Assassin's Creed spin to it. Like, I'm like, as a Christian and as a gamer, I want to play this game because you kind of went out of the box of like purely education, and you're like, we're just going to tell a perspective story, and we're going to tell a story about a personal struggle about one individual. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I've been waiting for this since I was a kid because my mom will let me play this game, right? And I'm a 30-year-old, 40-year-old man. So, anyways,
Adam, you bring up a good point. We really focused on kid-friendly, family-friendly, because we were focused on it, especially as kids. Mom picks what games get played in the house. And so we were like, okay, we've got to get past the mom, it's okay with mom. And so a lot of our stuff was kids focused all the way up to probably about 15, 16, 17. And Exodus Vigil was the first game we decided we're going to go for an older audience, and we're going to hit those kids that are at high school that all their kids are telling them, hey, let's go play Assassin's Creed, and sneak off, and mom doesn't know about it. And we're like, we got to give them an alternative. And then something when they go off to like Kevin's college and they're playing games in the dorm rooms and mom doesn't tell them what they can't play anymore, we want to give them something that's still fun and exciting. And that's why we designed it for that. Is we said,
but
okay,
edifying.
yep,
Is a huge thing. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Em. I hadn't heard your feedback, so thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Phil, you actually have two companies, one Christian and a secular version. Do you feel these market forces that have kind of put these parameters on there?
Yes, I've gone to conferences. I still go to conferences. I went to one conference, and I actually have to have two different booths just because of the focus. And I was at one conference where it was supposed to be all Christians there, so I had all the Bible Bite stuff out, and then I went to another conference which is both. It has secular and Christian, and I won't say the school district, but there was a school district here in my city, a very large school district, was coming through, and they were talking to us about our curriculum, and they were talking specifically about the kidwear stuff. And they'd heard really good things about it and said, we'd like to implement this in our school district. And the booths were right next to each other. And right next to it, you've got the computer Bible games, and you've got the Christian school one. And she looked over at it, and we were really far into discussion. She goes, is that your stuff too? And I said, yes, it is. And she goes, you guys do Christian stuff? And I said, well, we have a market, and we have a publisher that goes for Christian schools, and then we have one for secular. She goes, there's none of that in here, is there? And that was coming from the other side. And I was like, no, it's all family friendly. There's no Christian stuff in it. Now, of course, there's morals and ethics and stuff like that we would consider morals, but they saw, oh no, we can't have anything that's Christian in it. I go, there's none in it. And then they broke off negotiations. As soon as she saw the Christian version of the textbook sitting on the side. And so I've had that problem, but I've also had the opposite problem. I'll be at a homeschool conference, down in Oregon, actually. I was at one down there, and it's very conservative, and you don't put any of your secular stuff out at all, because a lot of them don't want their kids on the computer. And so when their kids come by and they see someone playing Exodus Vigil at the homeschool conference, the kids are like just glomming around us and playing. And the parents like, don't go over there. We don't play games. We don't do video games. It's not Christian. And so I'd have these talks with the parents because they come grab their kid. I said, oh, no, it's a Christian video game. And they're like, what? Is that possible? And so, it's different audiences. And so I've learned to work with both audiences. And so I know exactly and that's why you have to know exactly who your customer is, okay, what is it they're looking for? What is it they're trying to find for their family or for their school or for their fun, whatever it is. And then you design it for that. And then I've just learned just to divide both worlds. And so even on my website, you rarely will see any cross-reference between the two.
I've kind of cracked into a weird world with my game because I was invited to go to the San Diego Comic-Con to demo my game as we were playing it. I had a similar experience. I had one kid that walked past my set, and there's just so many people at Comic-Con. I've never been there, and it's just chaos. And I had one kid come up, and he's looking at it, and he's looking at the minis or whatever, and he looks at me, and he's just kind of like real stern, and he goes, my mom would never let me play this. And he walks off, because of the little monsters and stuff. And then I had another guy come and sit at my table, and he was dressed in the Doom Slayer costume from Doom. And his wife was there, and they were just kind of like just stern quiet the whole time they were playing. And then they got about, and he looks at me and he's like, I cannot leave this convention without this game. And I was like, well, I thought he was hating it. I was like, oh my God, this guy's going to like find me online and just destroy me or whatever. But you just really never know. But it was because I think he had a good time playing it, and B, I think it hit him in the heart. And so if Christian games kind of approach things where it's like, I just want to kind of take it to the heart of the matter and don't be afraid to tell stories that might stir people up. And I'm not interested, me personally, in my company, in marketing my stuff towards stuffy Christians who won't play it because of its, visuals. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I just didn't make it for you. It's not the game for you. And I think people are starting to realize that. But I mean, if you look at secular storytellers like Ted Decker and all these other guys like the Circle series and stuff, they do the same thing, and they're writers. I mean, what's the difference between writing a novel and making an interactive novel, which is a game or a video game? You're really just getting to interact with a story. And so
yeah, and those creators get the same judgment, right? They're not Christian
absolutely
enough at times, and they don't include all of these other aspects of the gospel. It's like there's this expectation that whatever we create as Christian has to include the entirety of Scripture and the gospel, which is just really unrealistic. But I love what you said, Adam, that brings so much freedom to say, I didn't make this for you. Jesus talked so much and the Pharisees would have so much to say about the things he was bringing to people, and so much judgment they cast on him. And in a way, it was almost like he said, well, this is this is for these people. I'm bringing freedom to all these people. So I love that. I don't know. I'm just going to take that statement with me, that who am I making this for? Am I making it for the people who already know who Jesus is, and maybe they're just stuck with expectations of religion, or am I making it for people who don't know him at all and just need some hope and joy?
Yeah. Amen. So let's jump to what is a Christian game. Moony defined it as three things. 1, it espouses Christian values. 2, it directly implicates Christianity in theming, narrative, or marketing. And then 3, would be called a Christian game by both the intended audience and by its developers. Kevin, you've been writing about this. How well does that align with what you've been thinking?
Well, I think he hits the relevant issues there, things that have been considerations in what people call Christian games. I think he draws the circle narrower than many people would. And this is the challenge when you're talking about something like genres, right? Like, or boundaries or definitions or whatever you want to use here as a term, is that it's a negotiated thing. It's a large cultural discussion. You were asking like who sets these expectations up, and then you gave a long list of things. The answer is yes, all of them, right? It's a big social conversation, and it includes people in the church, it includes people outside the church, it includes developers, it includes all kinds of different people. And so what I've found the most consistent as sort of a defining characteristic is for most people who use the term Christian is something to do with ideas, right? Something to do with belief systems and stuff like that. But I've also talked to people who are quite adamant that, you know, if a developer is Christian, then the game that person is making is a Christian game. It really kind of depends on who you ask, and for me, sort of as a scholar, sort of sitting back and going, like, you know, where are we going to land on this? Again, I think all those conversations are happening at the same time. So I think Moony's is one viable definition, and I think I love the fact that he actually talks about, you know, developer, audience, the ideas involved, and some other factors as well. I think that that's actually a really, really valuable that he's highlighted all those things. I'm just not sold that that's where the definition is going to land.
Yeah.
I don't think it can.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
think too controversial, because Christianity as a whole, like he said many times in the video about how this is like an American idea of like how, you know, Christianity is approached. And when you have so many denominations and so many different viewpoints, I mean, you could go to one church on one block, go across the street to another church, and you're going to get a totally different theological view on what fun is or gaming. And so, man, like it's a great acid test that he did with those 3 questions. But and throughout the video, I would go, yeah, and then I go, no, and then I go, yeah, okay, and then, right, because I come from a certain belief, so I'm like, I didn't even agree with everything, but like you said, what's the answer? It's like, yes, but no. And so it's like what Phil was saying, like it kind of makes you kind of crazy, because you're like, what side of this can I set on? And I do want it to be effective, and I want it to sell, but I really just want to make it good.
Fascinating to see kind of his definition. It felt very, very narrow to me. And I was watching the video, and I was immediately, I'm like, oh, blasphemous. I can't wait to throw blasphemous in his face. And he comes up, he's like, oh, so some people would consider blasphemous. Like, oh, he had that argument, but he kind of brushed over it. And I'm like, oh, I want to go back to that, because I found that game it's super fascinating. For anyone who has or hasn't played it, it's very it's drenched in this Catholic iconography, and I'm always fascinated to see a secular view sometimes on like the Christian, you know, broader Christian mythos, in the broadest terms. Not that the developers of Blasphemous necessarily were just like very secular. Like it felt like they understood this very, very deeply. And so he brings up in the video, like, oh, they might consider it a Christian game. And I would think like, oh, that's very fascinating, because I don't know if I would go so far as say it's Christian, but it is definitely within the realm of something I want to say is Christian, because it has so much connected to what a lot of Christians would understand as like themes and, you know, connection to the actual Bible, although then it takes it completely off the rails in a different direction. And a very fun game, but not one I would, you know, bring to my pastor and be like, let's teach on this. Let's teach the you know, gospel of blasphemous. He would be like, maybe not. And I think the biggest, like every time I try to think of a game, like, oh, and I'll try to say like, oh, ActRaiser from the Super Nintendo, that's a Christian game because it has a really strong theological, you know, perspective, and has one of the strongest messages I've ever seen in any game accidentally about kind of, you know, faith and all this, where you play as the master, which in Japanese it was just God, fighting Tanzra, the devil. And at the end, like the whole game is you have worshipers that will pray to you from their temples, and they always are begging you for help. And at the end of the game, you're like, let's go see all these civilizations you helped, and you go back to them, and all the temples are empty. And it kind of ends. The game ends on, interesting. Once you've helped them, they don't seem to pray to you anymore. I guess we're going to go back to our sleep again. And like the game ends, it's like, oh, that's a really powerful statement as a Christian. You know, I related to that really heavily. Like, oh, that's really poignant to have me like play through and kind of feel what it would be like to be, you know, God, and then helping everyone, and then everyone just ignores you. And really that emphasizing the haves and the have-nots, and why sometimes in America it's harder for people to connect with their faith because we have it so easy sometimes, and why it's easier in other countries to really like go all in. Like, oh, that was cool. But then again, can I call ActRaiser a Christian game? No, not necessarily, because there's always this budding up of almost a simple game style of what is the conflict? It's violence. How is the conflict of violence resolved? Further violence, but violence for good. And while the Bible has, arguably violence for good, so much of it is still the conflict resolution in the Bible is much more about like peaceful resolution. And we even have the greatest character of the Bible. Everyone expects him to show up riding a white stallion and wipe out everybody. And like, he's going to conquer everyone. He's going to be the king on the stallion. And how does Jesus show up? On a donkey. And does he conquer everyone? Technically, yes, but it's not a violent way. It's the most opposite of violence. He sacrifices himself and he wins everything. And so it's really difficult sometimes to wrap our heads around, like, how do we represent the ultimate Christian message in a game in a way that's still entertaining, because you want to entertain, but doesn't go against this, the point of the Bible. So we're always kind of fighting that, against this definition of like, what is it? Can it be Christian inspired? Or is it truly, what does it mean to be truly a Christian game? And I've wrestled with that, trying to come up with, game concepts myself. And I always feel like, anytime I want to do even something like, a Mario game, ultimately it's fun and friendly and happy, but you resolve everything by jumping on people's heads, which is, low level, like 1 out of 10 violent, but yeah, it's technically
that
not
poor
a Christian.
mushroom.
Yeah. And then every time you play like a Paper Mario game, you realize, all of the Goombas and Koopas are actually friendly too. So, oh no. So it's always the struggle of like, does that mean the Christian genre has to be locked into other type of genres, like a simulation type game? Like, I could build a civilization, and that's more Christian because I'm not based on violence. It's about, us versus resources or something, rather than us like human or character versus character. It's about character versus environment or something like that. So, or does it have to be like almost a walking simulator or some sort of visual novel? Like, how do we do it? And I struggle on that, and I'm sure you've all struggled to find that, like, thread that needle of how do we kind of hit every single target at once while still
well,
keeping
then you
our
start
faith.
getting into like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean, go ahead.
Oh no,
I
I'm
just
finished.
had an input on what you just said of like, now you're starting to get into like categorization, right? So like Phil's game is very much like historical, and then you have educational, and then you have fantastical. And then when you get into the fantastical, you have these lines. It's like, like you said about in this video about Lord of the Rings, and then Narnia, right? It's like, my mom doesn't like Narnia because it has magic in it, but it's very much a Christian allegory, whereas Lord of the Rings is very much like, I guess, maybe, nobody ever said that who created it, right? So then you have like, what, to me, I think it's the power source. So you look at superheroes, which I love, I drawn to, I wanted to make a game about superheroes. It's like, the gamma radiation, or the Earth's yellow sun, Superman's DNA. And then you have like, in my game, I wanted the superheroes to be, their power source was God, but they didn't figure it out right away. So they go, they're imperfect people, they're broken people, they're lost people. And then God finds them, and they're like, okay, now we have this power and we're trying to use it right. But then they fall, and they fall down, they fall down, fall down. And I think when you start telling a fantastical story, it's like, what's the dependency? What's the power source? And then how do you make that power source not preachy? It's not that like, hey, the hellfire brimstone thing, but like, we're in the age of grace. Well, how do you tell that story? Right. So, but how do you tell the story of real struggle? And I think like everybody here is in agreement with that of like, we just want to play games and being taken out of our element and just enjoy ourselves as a pastime. And if it's edifying, that's so much better. And people like The Chosen has cracked that code with the Bible, where it's just like, we've taken creative liberties, but like, this is who Christ is. And then boom, it blew up. It's like, well, why? It's because the stories just hit people in the heart. You're just like, oh my gosh, this just like, his video kind of ends on this, Mooney's video of like, I mean, we'll get there, but spoilers. But I really think it comes down to the story, your approach, and your power source. That's my opinion. And that's what drives me to make those types of games. And so
definitely feels like there's a tension or compulsion to label art and media in particular as Christian that doesn't exist in other areas of life, right? Like I think my dad, who is a pipe fitter and a plumber, he could look at a piece of piping and he could know like the person's values, right? Like they tell a story by the way that it's crafted. If you talk to any craftsman, they have deep ideals that they're striving for and deep convictions, and their work tells a story. But I wonder if like part of the compulsion with labeling something as Christian or not when it's related to art is one of the things that he brought up about the Protestant ethic, which I found very interesting. And he said in there that for the Protestant ethic, that everything you do must be to the glory of God, and leisure or worse, pleasure is a waste of God's time. There's no room in the equation for God's pleasure. So I wonder if part of the tension for me is that those other things serve a very concrete, like utilitarian purpose, where art is a little amorphous and harder to, I guess, from the Protestant ethic to actually get value out of. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I find it really offensive to think that the creator God created the entire world in 7 days out of his imagination, and then created us in his image with his creative spirit. And then a Christian comes in and says, how dare you be creative? And I'm like, it is the very essence of our nature to create. Like it is, because we are created in the image of the creator. So when people attack the imagination of creation, now I understand the debate between theology and all this other stuff, but when it comes down to like creativeness, when it comes to like God's passion, like passion of the Christ, right? It's God's passion for us to have passion for him in our creativity. That's why Jesus even said he spoke in parables. He told stories. That's how he taught. And so and for a Christian to come to me and say, how dare you be creative and tell a story?
One
I'm
of my
like,
favorite
what?
One of my favorite scriptures is at the very beginning in Genesis when it says God brought the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. And he's all knowing, but it's almost like he wanted to give Adam some creativity and wanted to see what he did with that. That frees me to just play a little bit, right? Like, is it okay if we just play with our time here on earth?
Come on.
It says Jesus died for the joy set before him. Wouldn't that be such a shame if we spent all our time just trying to work really hard to make him okay with us, to make him happy with us when he's already got that. We've already got that approval. I think about my kids, like when I've got 2 kids. If I give them a gift, I don't want to see them set it aside and go do more chores. I give it to them because I want to see them enjoy it and play with it. And it would be so sad to me if they felt like they couldn't experience the joy that I just gave to them.
What an awesome analogy that is. I love that.
Yeah. I think you can make a very strong case for Christians in the arts, Christian in creativity. I always go back to Tolkien's on fairy stories essay, and if you guys haven't ever read that, you should really read it.
Yeah.
It's all about subcreation and how we're imitating God when we create things. And it's a very explicitly Christian take on the value of creativity. And I resonate with what Adam and Chera are saying, and in my book I talk about that a little bit too. I thought what was interesting in the video is Moony isn't saying this is a good thing. He's saying
Right.
this is the thing that this sort of very serious minded nature of American Christianity. There's that strong strain that runs through it, and I do think that he's onto something there. That I think that a lot of Christians, a lot of Christian churches, a lot of Christian traditions have that sense of if you can't measure the productivity of something, then it is questionable in some way, shape, or form. I do. I'm not sure I'm totally on board with him on reducing everything back to the Protestant work ethic. I haven't read Weber for like over 20 years at this point, but I remember when I did read it, I thought, yeah, okay, he's explaining a lot here. I think sometimes he sort of flattens some things out, but
Sure.
Even if you accept the explanation, it's kind of like he's almost skipped the entire 20th century in the history of American church and American culture, because in the 20th century, American culture turned very hard away from that sort of Protestant work ethic and into this consumer capitalism mode. And life became about enjoying and playing and doing fun stuff. And him who has the most toys when he dies wins, right? And that's a very American thing, and it very thoroughly infiltrated the American evangelical church, especially by the 1970s, 1980s, where you see the health and wealth, prosperity gospels, and things like that. People aren't afraid to have the big car and the big house and stuff like that. And I'm not sure how that plays into this whole conversation. Maybe there's a certain amount of conflict at the heart of American Protestant Christianity, where on the one hand you've got this old leftover strain of the Protestant work ethic, and people are saying it's got to be serious and stuff, and at the same time they're like having their toys and their boats and their vacation homes and stuff, and going, I don't feel good about this. And so when it comes to games, they're like, yeah, okay, well, that's where we can say that's unproductive, that's a waste of time, and maybe we single games out. I thought the ideas that he was bouncing with there were great and incomplete, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out what to do with that, essentially.
Yeah. There's there's a book called The God Who Plays, which I read last year, and one of the parts in there that they brought up, which resonated with me with what Moony was saying, is this. He said, one problem that talking about play, was associated with what was seen as an inappropriate level of human freedom. Play is necessarily open-ended and subject to chance. The whims of participants and the results of various explorations that take place as the game progresses. Play, generally a high level of freedom, and for some, this seems to run counter to a theology in which everything is predestined, which he very much talked about the Calvinism, I don't know, frame that a lot of this is kind of wrapped up in as well.
I kind of live on the verse of Paul where he says, behold, Christ has completed all things, so therefore all things are lawful now. They're all lawful, but are all things edifying, right? So when you take into account that thing of like, okay, it's all lawful because we're covered under the blood, but is it edifying, which means uplifting and exhorting and spirit-filled and all of those things, the fruits of the Spirit, essentially, right? Are they intact? Are they in there? And does it lead back to the cross? Does it lead back to Christ? And so you got to take that into account when you're making it. And you can be as creative as you want, but just know that, like, just ask yourself that question as you're making these things of like, it's lawful, but is it edifying?
And if
and
that's
so
the
should
case,
I be? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, if that's the case, then we can't really have a definition of what is edifying for each person, because some things might be really edifying to me, but they might cause someone else to struggle. If I'm struggling with like alcohol or something in particular, then I can play a game with alcohol in it, no problem. Or if that's not my struggle, but if it's a problem for someone else, then it's not edifying for them. So that leaves a lot of gray area and a lot of room where we just have to use our spiritual discernment. Like, we have to be led by the Spirit, and I think that's the whole point.
That is the discernment. I agree.
Yeah.
Can I jump on the thing you were talking about with play? Because
go ahead.
Because that's actually something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I think is one of the biggest challenges with Christians approaching games and making games and thinking about games, is that play is in fact both exciting and dangerous at the same time, right? It's that open-ended, it's free movement within a bounded space, right? That's an academic definition I've always really loved. I think it does make sense. Play is free movement within a bounded space, right? You got your rules, and then within those rules you can do a whole bunch of stuff, basically. And And that is not traditionally how we have practiced religion in the Christian church. We are people of the book. The book does not change, right? And you can imagine a game where, well, we don't have to imagine a game where we're playing Jesus. That exists now. But you can imagine a game where you're playing Jesus and you give the game player the option where he doesn't die on the cross. What would you do with that? Like how would you even process something like that as a Christian? How would you interact with something like that? The very nature of a video game is something that encourages play, and the very nature of the way that we have practiced our faith historically is that we try to tamp down on what we see as heretical or problematic beliefs, right? And so there's sort of like this inherent tension with the form, which you're not necessarily going to get with a Christian novel or a Christian movie or something like that, where you have a fixed text and the user can't go in and like mess around with it and do something crazy with it. I think that actually does lie at the heart of some of the tension that the Christian community has with games.
So to speak to what you just said, when I started my game, there was some very specific things that I wanted to stay away from for very specific reasons. I didn't want to have, and this was just because I didn't want to get into a theological debate with people, despite my feelings about things. I wanted all of my angels in there to be male, because that's a big stink for a lot of people. They're like, oh, there's only male angels, right? We could go into theological discussion about that, whatever. I'm like, I just did that to stave off entertainment. I didn't want the characters in the game, the people who are playing, to play as angels for very specific reasons, because it does have a role element. And I also didn't want people to be able to make deals or bargain with the enemy itself. And so those were like, I had a mission statement that I had written about my game. I'm like, I don't want to do these for various reasons. Some of them because I don't want to get into theological debates. And also, I wanted to stay as true to the fruits of the Spirit as I possibly could and tell a human story from a human perspective. So I think that putting boundaries before you start writing a story and for a game, especially when you're talking about a role-playing game where you get to make decisions, it's very important to, like what you just said, like, oh, you get to play as Jesus and then decide whether you go on the cross or not. I don't think I would play that game, right? Like, that's just me personally. Maybe that will impact somebody differently, but I remember my mom listening to the Jesus Christ Superstar as a kid. I fell in love with that album when I was a kid. I have it hanging on my wall behind me. But there's a very, very huge controversial thing about it. It made Mary Magdalene look like she was romantically in love with Jesus, and then it left him on the cross at the end, right? That could be debated, but you're talking about a secular man, Tim Rice, who wrote a story about his perspective of what he thought Jesus was. And so I'm like, all right, so it's like you said, how can you contain that? How can you do that? You have to, like, I'm sorry, is it Chera? Chera. Okay, I'm sorry, I couldn't see it. Chera, you were saying that, like, you got to use discernment.
Yeah.
You just got to use discernment and do your homework, and ask the questions, like Phil was saying, and see where people are, so that, because we don't want to offend. We want to make games. We want people to play them. We want people to have a good time. We want them to be inspired and edified. So just do your homework and put boundaries on yourself.
It's kind of funny. When we took Exodus Vigil out, which is, you can kill things in it. And the first version of it we tested at Christian Game Developer Conference, 4 years ago. And you had the ability to kill someone. And I got a lot of feedback from parents at that conference said, that's not a good thing. We shouldn't do that. I was like, okay, good point. So now you get points taken away if you try to kill anything. But then we tested it at other conferences. I would say that were more conservative. And it was like, even having the ability to decide that was bad. And we're like, okay, let's take that out. We'll let you like kill chickens. And so you'll see chickens all around. I don't know if you've ever paid attention in the game. And we're demoing it at CGC 2 years ago, and the kids come up, and the first thing they're doing is they're running around killing all the chickens in the game. I'm like, and the moms and dads are just looking over their shoulder. I'm like, you could play the story, but they're sitting there killing all the chickens. And so there's just something inside of, especially in boys, that they just want to, chop things up. And so if they can destroy something, they'll go do it. So you can still kill chickens and cows in our game.
Well, and though. It's so frustrating to me that it's almost like, can we not even talk about it? Like, do we have to pretend like sin doesn't even exist? Because it does exist, and we're all doing it all the time if we're honest. So it's very frustrating, and I feel like as a believer, we should be the ones talking about it. We should be the ones talking about what really happens when you engage with the flesh and lean into the things that God says are not good.
Yeah.
And I'll just expose myself. Y'all can judge me for it. But my favorite TV show of all time is Breaking Bad. It's my absolute favorite. And it's terrible for a lot of reasons. But the thing I love about it is it shows someone who completely indulges in his own whims, his own pride. And what happens as a result is so much pain and so much loss. And to me, that's a real picture of the world and the brokenness. And I think as Christians, we should be able to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the very heart of God and loving people is He gives people freedom. I mean, even the angels have freedom to choose not to serve Him, right? Like that's the awesomeness of games. I think is that choice, and God gives it to us all over the place.
And I'm sorry, the Old Testament is way more violent than Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad or any of those. I'm like, just read it. Like it's hardcore. And the God of the Old Testament, who's still the God of now, is hardcore. Like he's like, I'm not playing around right now. Like you've gone too far. And so I don't think it's wrong to allow people to explore a certain avenue. Phil, I thought it was a great idea that you would put limits on it. It's like, okay, yeah, you can kill people, but it's not going to go well for you, because then it becomes a tale of morality, right? It's like, okay, and then you can stifle the level of violence. Like you don't have to show blood, right, or whatever that is. But I don't think that that's a wrong thing, and I think that nowadays people are starting to wake up to that. As far as Christian media goes, they're starting to say, you know what, people don't. It's not that people don't like Christians; it's that people don't like powerless Christians.
Right.
And so, if we're not bold to step out and say, hey, this is what I believe and why I believe it, and be real. It's like, hey, I'm struggling too. I'm struggling hard. I got Jesus. He's not my crutch. He's my everything. So far more than a crutch. But yeah, anyways.
One of the things we struggled with, we have 4 characters that you can play in our game, and one of them is a female assassin. And so, she's grown up and she's got quite a backstory that why you find out why she's that way. And it was a tough story to tell in a way that, parents would be okay with it. And we walked that line, and we went back and forth on some of the things. We said, you know what, we're not going to talk about what happened in her past, because we used to have that in the backstory. If you read the book, you'll see that in the book, and that's Chris Murray's story, Exodus, God of the Slaves, but it goes into all the details of that too. But how much of that do we put into the game? And that was something we struggled with.
And I know that that's what the purpose of this video that Moony made is. He's just trying to ultimately get to the point, because it was kind of a hard video for me to listen to. But I was like, all right, I'm going to wait till the end. And he summarizes it. I'm like, all right, man, that's pretty spot on. So we'll get there, I'm sure. But
well, let's jump into the meat of his argument. He says there aren't very many Christian games, and of those that exist, there aren't very many good ones. So when I heard that, obviously, good is very subjective. So I was trying to place a definition on good. So I was asking, is that ratings? Is it sales? Is it notoriety? From what I could tell from the video, the answer seems to be from him that good Christian games are games that are engaging enough to compete with said unchristian games. Is that what you guys kind of got as well, or what did you have a definition of good different from that?
I think that was implicit. In what he was saying, that basically it should be competitive, sort of like with the AAA titles and stuff like that. But what I found funny about that is he kind of undercut his own argument with the example of the good Christian game that he gave, because he kept coming back to fun. And that Dragon Cancer, which I agree with him is the best Christian game ever made, is not fun. Brock, you know that.
Well, can I also say that, well, 2 things. One is he gave that example of was it the Wisdom Tree game that sold 350,000? Like in that case,
Okay, I like that.
that's I mean, that was just a tremendous amount of games. So in that case, like if part of it is engaging, I don't know, it had the sales. To your point on that Dragon Cancer, I would say that the third point of his definition of Christian games is would be called a Christian game both by the intended audience and as developers. None of us on that team would call that a Christian game. Like we don't subscribe to the to that label. But it was very much about putting the Greens' faith right in the open and being honest and open about it and just being just authentic. But it wasn't. We wouldn't label it as a Christian game. So, but obviously he has no way of knowing that.
We're in a fantastic spot right now in the industry where the rise of the indie game has kind of given the chance for voices that wouldn't have had a voice otherwise. I don't think we're ever going to see a AAA Christian game. I don't think it's physically possible. None of the AAA companies would ever touch that unless it's something like Dante's Inferno. That's a different video entirely to talk about. But because all of them are so concerned with staying away from anything that by and large the kind of pop culture or like general culture is opposed to, like they're like, nope, we're not gonna say or do anything that's gonna get us in hot water. I mean, we're gonna keep this as, you know, Christ can be in your heart but not in our games kind of thing. Whereas the indie scene now offers this potential to any indie game can break out and be something magical and wonderful. And you can even say like Untitled Goose Game is very Christian inspired because it's just about good mischief. It's fun mischief being a goose. No one's hurt ultimately. It's just enjoying the splendor of the world that God gave us as a goose. But of course, again, not a Christian game. But the point is that you can make a game now about anything. So we have this chance for indie studios to come along, but then we're once again fighting that fight of as soon as you label yourself as Christian, you cut off the majority of the audience that would be searching around like on Steam or Epic Games or something. So then do you have to kind of go into further and further away from the mainstream to make this? How do you find that chance to break through? Where that's the constant struggle. Again, I still think we're in a spot where we can make truly amazing things that we can just be like, can't label me. I know what it is. You'll know what it is. You can play, you know, a good game can be a good game now. Doesn't necessarily have to have. I mean, we have impossible genres to classify. I mean, the creator of Stardew Valley is going to make a new game where you inherit a haunted chocolate factory. What even is that genre? I don't know. I can't wait to play it. But we're in a new place where genres are becoming less and less meaningful, and I'm excited for the possibility within the next 5 or 10 years to see like we can just make it's game's a game. It is kind of like movies and books. Like a lot of times movies and books are just movies and books. It's just a good book, good movie, whatever it is.
Yeah. I almost prefer the term faith-based rather than Christian because a lot of the times it's just this negative connotation, the way that social media and the way the world is now. You hear the word Christian, it's like a trigger word for a fight, right? And it's because there's so many. I mean, we bicker amongst each other worse than we bicker with anybody else. And so I almost say, like, I find that most people who play my game are actually non-Christian. And I didn't put like the word Christian in my game or in my novel that goes with the game. There's none of that stuff. There's just what's faith, who's God, and how do you tap into this unlimited power? And I think that it's good that we're not able to make a AAA game with a AAA studio. Otherwise, we're going to get a game that looks a lot like the Noah movie they made a while back. You know, it's like, what was that? You know what I mean? Somebody's going to come in and be like, oh, we got to take this out. We got to take that out. And it's going to become something, I hate to use the word, but blasphemous. Like,
I did notice that movies are now call themselves faith-based movies. Have you noticed that label's been used a lot?
Which is a broad term, and that can be questionable, you know. But again, you do your homework, especially if you're buying something for your kids, right? It's like, do your homework. look into it, dig deeper than just the surface of what it is, and say, okay, this is for me, or this is for my kid, or I would or wouldn't play that with anything, Christian or not. It really just comes down to personal responsibility and discernment.
I think the standard of fun for games is limiting. I think that what the goal should be is to make a game worth playing. And that is it's a broader standard, but I think that if that's what Christians are aspiring to do, that you're eventually going to succeed, both commercially and artistically at that point.
I've kind of just fallen under compelling, and I think there's a lot of different reasons why something is compelling. And I think it's better like a novel or other artwork. Like, you don't have that need for fun. I guess that requirement. And then even if you just look at a gaming experience over a long piece of time, like if you zoomed in, oftentimes you're not really having fun. Maybe you're grinding, maybe you're like struggling on a problem, but you're still there. You're engaged. It's got your attention and your focus, and you want to be part of that experience, but it's not fun maybe in that moment. So
I agree with you, because like I say all the time, like everybody games, right? And whether it's baseball, football, you nerd out on, like, maybe you're a model builder or you have a hobby. Everybody games in some way, shape, or form. But if you do it well, it takes craft and it takes skill. I've thrown my controller across the room before. Like, I'm like, I am done with this, right? I'm just trying to have fun. And like, dude, compelling is a fantastic word. I wish we could almost change the word gaming to something else, because sometimes it's just that word gaming just implies, oh, it's games. People think they put a frame Monopoly or Yahtzee or something, but sometimes it's deeper than that. And like you said, it's compelling. I think compelling is a great word.
Yeah, Ryan Green and I have had a lot of conversations about the term video game, about how at least for a lot of the stuff that he wants to make wouldn't fall under that game category, right? Video games have become all types of different things, way beyond like a game. Their experiences, their worlds, their all sorts of different things. So let's talk about the problems with Christian games, at least how Moony defines them. He makes 3 points, and the first one is overly didactic, too educational. Number 2, overly derivative, worse versions of existing ideas. And number 3, low quality or cheaply made. How do those strike you?
He's not wrong.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't want to say he's right, but he's not wrong either.
Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, it just reminds me of like of the same things we've talked about with music over the years, right? Or Christian movies. Like you put a Christian idea in it, and that becomes the loudest thing in your craft, in your creation, and then we call it good, we call it done. But I don't think. I just think people can read into it. I think they can smell it. They can smell the agenda from a long ways away. And so that becomes the only thing that they take away from it.
I'm finding that the case with secular games lately. I'm like, whoa, this used to be a fun game, and it just, like, Destiny just changed on me. And I was like, whoa, what happened to Destiny?
Yes, right. A secular movie with an agenda. The same thing. We're like, oh, that's what this was about. Okay. And then it kind of sours the whole experience for us.
Yeah. Andrew Peterson, in his book Adorning the Dark, says, one great problem with much art that's called Christian is agenda, as you spoke to, which is to say that it's either didactic or manipulative or mere pragmatic. In other words, the artistic purity of the work tends to take a backseat to the artist's agenda. Langle says art that isn't good, by definition, is not Christian art. While on the other hand, art that's good, true, and beautiful is Christian art, no matter what the artist believes.
I think that reflects very much what Tolkien is saying on fairy stories too, right? Yeah. When we are doing creation that reflects the core shared experience of humanity, just by nature, we're going to be telling the biblical story. We're going to be in some form, and we're going to be telling the human experience. So tell good stories, make compelling stuff, make games worth playing, and the great stuff is going to be there.
Do you think part of the problem is that we're holding each other and ourselves to a very high standard?
Absolutely.
That maybe we need to allow some room for us to be works in progress, allow some room for us to be not as polished as we would like to present ourselves.
I agree very much with Chris that actually we are in a good moment for that. Because when you look at a lot of indie games, they are flawed typically, but they have a really interesting idea and a core gameplay loop that's compelling and that's fun. And so you can deal with a lot of stuff that's not that refined. And so, yeah, let's seize this particular moment to try some stuff that's interesting and different and weird and maybe not totally polished.
I think also we have the challenge of the chicken and the egg, because when you're working on a game and you're making it better and better and polishing it, the more expensive it gets. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have people who are supporting it and helping you build it along the way, I mean, you look at The Chosen and other crowdfunded things, they had people believed in it when it was pretty rough, and the more money got into it, the more the production costs went up and the production values went up. And they'll tell your story. I just finished listening to another documentary on The Chosen. But it's same in game development. With Exodus Vigil, we're at a point where okay, we can make it go to the next level, and we've got a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff we want to work on, but it's going to take money and time. And trying to get someone who will invest in it, which is almost impossible. All the investment in it right now is me. And trying to sell it to someone else to invest in it is hard. And then getting your community, they're like, well, it's not yet. Well, I don't want to pay $20 for that. That's a $2 game, or that's a $3 game. And when you get to a $20 game, I'll pay a $20 game. And then you've got AAA studios that are putting, $10 million, $100 million into games. And so, yeah, people are paying $60, $70, $80, $99 for, a season pass, because they're supporting it. And so they're able to put a lot more polish onto it, and they can hone in on a whole bunch of stuff. And in our community, we don't have that ability. And I experience it in all our stuff we work on. And we get to a point where this is all we can do because this is what we can invest in it. I mean, I know other games people represented here where they ran out a lot of money just to make it as good as they could. But until someone said, okay, we'll buy it and we'll invest in it, and they don't, then you can't take it to that next level or make the next edition or whatever it is, or the DLC.
I feel you, Phil, on that one, because I'm the same way. Me and my wife, it was just the two of us. And I live in rural Nevada in the middle of the desert. I don't live in LA. I can't go down the street and find an artist or anything else. So I had to figure everything out on my own and independently. But I just kept pressing, and it took me 6 years. And this is a board game. I don't need coders and designers and painters, and that was hard enough. I can only imagine what it's like in the video game industry. But there's also a beauty to independent development too, because you have a lot more freedom. I've been in advertisement before where I was a creative director or the editor or whatever. And even if you get 5 different creatives in a room working on one project, it turns into almost an impossible mountain to climb. Because you have all of these different people with different ideas and all these different things. And when you sit through a movie and you watch the credits scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll, I watched that and I'm like, how did they pull that off? So many different creative minds. And but when it's personal, right, and independent I think this is why a lot of people love independent games, because the good ones, they're personal. They come from a personal place. And I think a lot of us, almost all of us here, can relate to that. Of some of the best experiences I've ever had was independent. And what inspires me is George Lucas's story and how he created Star Wars. Nobody supported him. No. Nobody put anything into it. And he's like, I got to figure out how to make a ship fly through this giant thing. And he's like, I'm just going to take a bunch of garbage and put a camera in the pickup, and I'm just going to drive through and make it look, and I'm going to use the blue sky as a green screen. And he just pulled this thing off that turned the world upside down forever, because they're like, no more space movies. We don't need another Buck Rogers, And so he makes Star Wars because he could. And then people beat up the prequels because he had unlimited resources, and he lost that passion of his independent, I want to make this work. And that's what made Star Wars rich, is that he did what he could with what he had. And I think if we can just find some way to be happy, because I struggle with that. I'm like, gosh, I wish somebody would just support me. If we could just, as creators, just be happy with what we have and just make it work. It works well because people will see, when they do see it, they will see the passion. They don't really need the spit and polish. I think that a lot of people are turned off by that nowadays.
That's good. Some advice that we had, we just released Bug and Seek, a bug catching game. And some advice that we got early on was don't call yourself like studio. Don't try to present yourself as something bigger than you are. And so we really leaned into that and just started telling everybody, there's two of us. It's just two of us making this game. And here we are, and we're doing the best we can. And the response to that has been really good. I think they went from having higher expectations to going, oh, wow, two people made this. And that was really helpful for us. So I'm like, why did we even feel the need to present ourselves as something more professional, more validating, maybe? But yeah, I hope we can do more things like that as a community.
I think that's the power of testimony too, right? Hearing a testimonial is like, it's authentic and it's human, and it speaks to some of the problems I think that we've talked about on some of the other maybe Christian media that we've it's just not real at a certain like, because it's so polished, it becomes kind of fake and not human and doesn't have enough dirt on it, I guess, right? Like, because my life's messy and some days I'm a hot mess. And I think that's the power of testimony, is just like the struggle and the vulnerability, and authenticity. And yeah, there's I think there's real power in that. And that's kind of what the heart of like Numinous Games was about, that they saw the games that they wanted to make were sharing people's stories.
One of the biggest, riskiest things I see when it comes to specifically like faith-based or the Christian perspective, when we're creating something, there is actually, I mean, I agree we should be allowed to be messy and make mistakes. On the other hand, our message has to be, we have to hit that bullseye. And if we don't, we could cause it could be very, very damaging to people. For instance, my personal experience. So when I was in college, friend, because he knew I was Christian, and he's like, I love this book. It's called Lamb by Christopher Moore. And I read it and I loved it. I adored it. The book is told from the perspective of Biff, the 13th apostle, who is Jesus's childhood pal. I loved the book because it, like, here's the book here, it's hilarious comedy novel of Jesus, struggling with what he's going to go through the lens of his screwed up friend Biff, who is a sinner. And in the book kind of has this idea of like, well, Christ can't experience these sins, so Biff has to experience them and describe them to Christ. It takes place widely through this, the years between Christ born, Christ, 10-year-old Christ at the temple, and then 30-year-old Christ starting his ministry. And it fills in that gap. And a lot of the story takes place with him going to the East and meeting like Buddhist monks and stuff, and integrating this idea into the Christian faith. And I exited this book saying, this is my favorite book. It's so wonderful. It really puts Christ in a perspective that I loved. And it took me years to finally start reading the Bible for myself and look at the real Christ. And the danger was I latched onto a Christ that I liked because this was my limited understanding. And I'm like, I like this one because he feels like a buddy, and he's screwed up too. And he has a best friend who's really screwed up, and he loves his best friend. It's great. It's all fun and games until I read the actual Bible. I'm like, oh boy, that I was getting close. I was getting close to the flames there. Like I'm making grievous errors in how I'm viewing theology, and I'm not biblical in my, I was coming up, I'm telling my dad, he was Christian, but he didn't have a really deep faith. And so we didn't ever talk. So I was telling him after, I'm developing, like, oh yeah, they're all the same religion. Everything's the same, Buddhism is the same. Even atheists might be the same as Christianity. And my dad's like, yeah, you have a good idea. And we just spun each other up with bad theology, thinking that we were in the right path. And then once I came out of it, we both kind of came out at the same time. I'm like, oh, whoa. Mostly, and I thank my wife for this, because she was much more keyed in and much more biblically sound. And she kind of corrected me and helped me to grow in my faith and my understanding. And so circling back, the risk of this is even something like The Chosen. Like, I saw the first season of The Chosen, I loved it. And there was the risk that I had, and I had to step back and I said, do I love this because I like how this is showing Jesus, or is this really Jesus? And the deep, deep risk that we pose is, once we give an image, like if we are off the mark by a hair in how we present something, it could have devastating ramifications for untold people. And knowing that, I mean, it should weigh heavy on us, and we still have grace to make mistakes. And when we're trying, that's important. But we also do have that immense responsibility of, if we're leading people, and gaming especially, we're leading children in a direction, like it should weigh heavy on us to know, like, how are we present? Like, if we're off that mark, yeah, I may be shooting from a foot away, but if I'm shooting from 100 feet away, a little off the mark, suddenly I'm way further it goes. And so, like, if I accidentally say something or do something that gets a kid to start thinking about something, just a little thing that's unbiblical, or like a little skewed, or like a little incorrect, by the time they've grown up, 10, 20 years in the future, like, have they integrated this one mistake that I made into their theology? And so I think that's one of the hardest parts is working in this, is we all want to do the best. We come to it from this true heart for Christ and wanting to do the right thing. And we have to constantly fight back a bit against do I want this to be this because it's fun, or because I like it, or do I want this to be true because it's true? Or do I just think this is the true that I've said? How am I reevaluating?
This is why it's so important to surround yourself around people who can look at your stuff before you go into it and know what you believe and why you believe it, so that when people do come up and ask you, that's why I put a disclaimer in front of my book saying, hey, there's true spiritual truths in this, but this is a work of fiction. For the absolute truth, go and read the Holy Bible, because it's like, I let people know right out of the gates, like, this is a work of fiction, but I did everything I possibly could theologically to stay as sound as I could. And at the end of it, I did write a 6-part Bible study that goes with it. So it's like, you can take each chapter of my game, break it down, and you can use it in a Bible study lesson. And I had multiple different people around me saying, okay, this is on point. This is on point. This is on point. I needed that affirmation. And so you make a really good point, Chris. I think that's very important to understand what Christ did.
I always go back to something my mom said to me when I was a kid. I won't tell you the context of how she did it, but it was Philippians 4:8. It says, finally, brothers, sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. And Paul said that as his statement, finally, brothers and sisters. So I always go back to that going, okay, is what I'm doing, is it noble? Is it right? Is it pure? Is it lovely? Is it admirable? Is it excellent? Is it praiseworthy? And a lot of times I have to pull stuff out because I go, nope, that was something I thought was cool. And it wasn't.
Yeah. I get your point. I guess I would just submit maybe a counterpoint that, do you think that puts too much emphasis and weight on the creator and minimizes God? I guess I just wonder, like, I don't think any of us are going to hit the mark perfect, right? We all have limitations in our abilities and thinking, and we might get stuff slightly wrong. Just like there's all these different competing theologies and arguments and everything. Like, there's weight to communicating, a truth that we know, at least in part. But I feel like that's also that pressure that comes, that you're kind of addressing, is part of the reason why people feel like they need to, like, put everything into the game and shoot their shot, because this is their one opportunity to interact with people, and this is like their mission field, right? But one thing that God's been showing me is that the game is just a part of what the mission field of games is actually. It might be one touch point that has like a massive surface area where lots of people will touch it. But you can't necessarily go super deep. And like the work day in and day out in our teams, at conferences, in podcasts, and different online, like those are all other opportunities. I guess I would just hopefully, I guess my hope would be that we somehow give developers permission and release them to not feel the need to be overly didactic and having such a strong agenda that kind of keeps them from being I guess that trips up their art.
I very much echo that, and I would say two things. That communication always involves both the sender and the receiver, right? There is the person who creates a message, and there's the person who interprets it. And both of those things are incredibly important in the communication process. And it's not just on one side or the other. And so the second thing that goes with that is part of the project of Christian games, if that is a dream for people, is on the players, and it's on Christians to learn to be critical thinkers as they approach text, because they're going to be looking at games of all sorts, and they need to be able to think for themselves, and they need to be able to play through things and think critically and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with that, and that's okay. There's going to be all kinds of pieces of art out there, and those pieces of art that you might later come back and say, I don't actually agree with this, and I did at one point in my life. That's part of God's path leading us, through our lives and processing things and sort of figuring things out. So I think there is quite a bit of power with the game creator, but it's not the only part of the process that matters. And I really do think that Christian gamers need to take responsibility for what they're doing and how they're doing it as well.
I will say I agree, Chris, that there's a huge responsibility if we're going to say this is who God is, and let me tell you who He is. We talked about the Chosen a little bit here and there. I'm a big fan of the Chosen, but yeah, there's some creative liberties taken there, and there's a whole generation of kids probably growing up taking those creative liberties as scripture. And they'll have to sort that out later. But I grew up without the Chosen and had a bunch of dysfunction I had to sort out too. So I think we all got our particular brand. But I think there's a big difference between saying this is who God is and this is my experience with God and what I've learned. And I have something to learn from every single person who shares their experience with me. And so I think if we look at it as, what does God have for me here? What does He have for me here? That's a very different position than saying, okay, here is the one ultimate truth, because really there's only Scripture is the only one thing that we can look to as the, complete truth. But yeah.
And that's why I was mentioning before too about the whole disclaimer thing, because I know that I'm not going to hit the mark, and I know somebody's going to disagree with me, and I know you can't please everybody, especially within the Christian industry. You're going to have, one person's going to praise it, one person's going to shoot you down. And I have had people come up to me in church, flat out, rip my guts out for what I was trying to do. They're like, oh, you're trying to make a profit off of God. And I'm like, if I sold every single one of the games I produced, I'm still in the hole. Like, I'm doing this because I love it, and I'm trying to do something new. I'm not doing this because I wanted to be rich. I'm like, I got plenty of other things I could have gone for, And so,
what if you did get rich? Would that be wrong?
I would love to just make enough to keep doing it. Honestly, if I could just make enough to stay afloat, to just keep doing, because I am an idea minefield. Like, I've got 3 other games I'm working on, and I looked at what it takes to produce this one, and I'm like, how am I going to do that? Right. But I'm in this moment. This is where I am. And I try not to let that eat my lunch, but okay, so be it. I mean, think of the guy I forget his name, the guy, the head of the Chosen. Like, you think you would have went back 6 years ago and said, hey, this is where you're going to be in 10 years. You're going to actually be showing it across movie theaters. He would have been like, I can't even think about that right now. You know what I mean? Just let me do what I'm doing and be in the moment, and just put your passion into what you're doing. And don't, like you said, Brock, let's not limit ourselves as artists. Let's not put a box around it. Be careful, have discernment, of course.
Yeah.
Know who Christ is and know why, but at the same time, like, if you're going to make a quote unquote Christian game, tell the story you need to tell,
That's good.
and make it personal. That's my opinion.
We are a little over an hour and a half. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Was there any other point in the video that anybody wanted to talk about?
Could we talk about the very, very last statement?
Sure. What is it?
How he brought it home. So he kind of been saying what we've been saying about how, just make it passionate. But then he's like, maybe it doesn't need to be so much less Christian, but less American.
Mm.
That was like his final statement. And I'm like, wow, that can be taken a million different ways. You have to watch his video in context to understand the statement. But with that said, I understand that he was talking about, I don't know. I guess I'm just bringing that up to see what you guys think.
So it's interesting. I worked with a European studio for 4 or 5 years, one of the ones on the back wall here. And we had long conversations about American perspective of Christian games versus a European perspective, and even theology. And there was a concern about, how would the American market take this game versus, European market, and what they wanted to say from their perspective. And some of the stuff they were worried about my influence on it as an American Christian. And we had long theology discussions before we could even get into the game discussions. They figured out, hey, Phil's actually, he's balanced. He's a normal guy. He's not what we see on TV. Because what they see on TV over there about American Christians are not us. They don't see us. They see, well, we know who they see on TV.
Yeah.
And that's how they perceive American Christianity or evangelical Christianity. And so if they knew us, which they got to know me, I got to know that studio very well because I spent a lot of time with them. They're like, oh, okay, they are normal, but they have a different perception of us too, based on our media, what they see too. And when we develop relationships, one-on-one people relationships where we're talking to them all the time overseas, they get a totally different perspective of us because they've seen us through our media. And so I'm wondering if that has something to do with it too, because I had to break down some barriers, say, no, not all American Christians are like what you see in the media.
That's certainly part of it.
Thank you for doing that, man. I appreciate it.
That's certainly part of it. I think I'm the only non-American here. Yes? Okay.
You don't consider Canada non-American. You're on the American continent.
So there we go. See, there, right there.
Sorry, I had to do it.
Right there.
Don't pull me.
You're cool enough to be an American, Kevin, right?
So I am a Canadian, and I'm a child of Dutch immigrants, and I did all my post-secondary study in the United States, in Michigan and Iowa. So I've lived in the United States for 8 years. I lived overseas in Europe for 3 years and in Africa for half a year, and have been involved with various international ministries all my life. So in response to what he said at the end of the video, I think he's bang on. I think that you are absolutely right, Phil, that there is this perception of American Christianity overseas that is media constructed, that is sort of a caricature, as all media representations are, by the way. This is not limited to the presentation of American conservative Christians overseas. There's lots of caricatures, left, right, center, you name it. Different ethnic groups, different, whatever so it's not unique to Christians. And that caricature, yes, is a problem, and it's relatively easily dispelled when you're actually in conversation. But I will say this, having lived in mainline and evangelical circles at various times, there are a series of American assumptions about the nature of Christianity that I think are completely unexamined most of the time. I just don't think even people realize that it's there. And why would you? You've lived your entire life in this particular area. America is the media capital of the world. So the kind of world picture that gets built around you, it's hard to find hard to find an alternative. So it's not like, this is not a statement of judgment. It's just, a realization of the fact that we all live in particular cultures, and we adapt unknowingly a whole series of understandings of the world. And when you do look at the broader Christian experience around the world, it there's a remarkable diversity within the church, politically, socially, culturally. The body of believers who confess Jesus Christ as their Lord is massive, and I think that the world of Christian video games can certainly benefit from bringing in other perspectives. Not because the American one is particularly flawed in comparison to others, but it's just one way of experiencing Jesus from a particular national narrative. And so I think he's bang on. I think Christian games can benefit from different perspectives from around the world of people that confess Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. So
I think we'll end right there. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Thanks.
That was really interesting.
So good to talk with you all.